I'll start with that. You apologized to the Glass family this morning. Why was it important for the state to do that? And do you feel that other agencies should have gone further and issued an apology?
There were several state agents on site. They didn't pull the trigger, but they were there in the tragic death of Christian Glass. And so on behalf of the state, I wanted to apologize to his parents for a death that should not have happened in Colorado. And I wanted to thank them for turning tragedy into action. And it's so hard when this happens. I can't even imagine happening to your son as a father, but they are trying to be a force for making sure that this happens less often in America and in the state of Colorado.
I've heard you talk about crisis response before. How big of a priority is that in the state right now, and what can you do from your position to make it more of a priority?
It's a big priority for the state. Keep in mind that the actual response is locally directed. So these are not state responders, but what can we do? We can fund co-response models, and we are. And we have grants in place for local jurisdictions that want to implement. We can make sure that we have better training for law enforcement officers to know when to call and help. When somebody's undergoing a mental health crisis, as Christian was, the best response usually includes a mental health professional, a social worker. It's not necessarily the heavy law enforcement response. And we also want to make sure our law enforcement folks are freed up to fight crime and not deal with this behavioral health issue, which is a much different issue.
I hear from some, like the sheriff of Summit County, for example, who talks about the funding issue, where one year he'll get a grant for $400,000, expects that the next year and gets $30,000 and struggles to fund it. Is there a more robust funding mechanism that might be available?
So I hope so. Traditionally, law enforcement has been locally funded in our state. What we've done over the last couple of years, as part of our overall plan to make Colorado one of the 10 safest states, is to invest. Now, the way the state does our budget, we support recruiting and retaining law enforcement co-response models, is we do our budget year to year. And yes, we've been able to invest heavily over the last 2 years. It'll be in our budget again. We're going to fight for additional investments next year. But the state doesn't really do a multi-year investment. There's a legislature. They have to approve the budget every year. And we just have to fight for the resources we need to keep Colorado safe.
What should crisis response look like in your mind? How close should these teams be to local jurisdictions?
Well, this is part of the tragedy of the event. Is if it had occurred one county over, as an example, in Summit County, they have a co-response model that's very effective. In fact, we highlighted that as a model. We need to have this everywhere. And I know that many of our rural jurisdictions have a tough time even recruiting law enforcement folks or having behavioral health specialists. So I think incorporating virtual in some of those instances is going to be important, as well as making sure we have the compensation piece in place across Colorado, so that nobody experiences a unnecessary tragedy like the Glass family experienced here in our state, unfortunately.
Knowing that it's slower to roll out in some different communities that may be more kind of not as quick to implement a system like this, should the state step in and say you need to have it?
We'd be open to the conversation about what the basic level of response we need to have across the state is. I think it'll be a question of also what funding we can provide to get there. As I say, historically, law enforcement's locally directed, local police chiefs, elected sheriffs. We're not stepping on their toes, but I do think it's fair to say, what are the minimum standards that we need to have, and how can we make sure that what happened to Christian doesn't happen to anyone else here in our state?
Lastly, what's your reflection on the settlement for the Glass family? Some of the things included in it are certainly unique.
Yeah. Well, I say kudos to the family. I mean, there's no way to get Christian back, and there's no price on that, and the money piece is consistent with other settlements. And I told the family, I'm glad you're able to move past this. I mean, fighting stuff in the courts for years is just doubles the trauma. But what I was really glad to see is that the family was interested in a lot more than that, and they're doing a video that will be used for helping to train officers. They were kind enough to give some of Christian's really amazing art that we'll be displaying at the state capitol. And they've made Colorado their home. They have their daughters here. As you know, they're from New Zealand. Have a hard time understanding how something like this could even occur in Colorado or in America. We know that it occurs too often. I think that they're going to be a permanent part of making sure that this happens less in our future, and that less parents have to go through what they went through.
Governor, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.